When we develop any quality of hospitality towards our sorrow, it ripens us and deepens us. And it expands our capacity to be with what is.
Mm.
And not only in my life, but also in the community, also in the watershed, also in the culture, And that's what we need right now.
Welcome to Point of Relation with Thomas Hübl, a podcast that illuminates the path to collective healing at the intersection of science and mysticism. This is the Point of Relation.
Today's episode was previously recorded for an online event with Thomas. Although it took place at an earlier date, the insights and discussion remain relevant.
Our guest for today's episode is Francis Weller. Francis Weller is a psychotherapist, writer, and soul activist. He is the author of the best-selling book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Rituals of Renewal and the Sacred Work of Grief. We hope you enjoy this conversation.
A warm welcome to everyone, and a warm welcome to you, Francis. So maybe we can bring you on as well for a moment.
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, glad to be here. Glad to be with you all.
Good to be with you again. I thoroughly enjoyed our last conversation for the podcast, I guess it was, and I felt so much resonance with you and your work, and I'm happy that we have more time together. I would love to hear more your experiences, your work around building collective containers. You build a lot of collective containers or vessels for grieving as a very important function that is, I think, often underrepresented in our society, I think. But the whole notion of we need collective containers for kind of healing or for integration, for processing our life experiences. And so maybe you can speak a little bit to that, and then we will zoom into some of the juicy specific aspects of that.
Thanks. Very good to be here with all of you. And thank you, Thomas, for inviting me back. I think one way we could just begin is just acknowledging that certain things require holding spaces. That we could say that certain experiences of depth, of grief, rage, anger, loneliness, they really require a holding space where the emotional content of that material can come forward. I often write about the fact that grief work requires two things. It requires containment and release. But when we're left to it by ourselves, which is typically the way we carry our grief, I can't do both jobs at the same time. So I become a permanent containment field for grief, and it never gets to be set down, never gets to move forward. So if you notice, we are recycling old grief stories, not only ours, we're recycling ancestral grief stories. I mean, we are just constantly chewing on them to the point where without that containment field, this material kind of overshadows our lives and really begins to diminish the vitality with which I engage this world. What I love about grief work is that it really has the potential of bringing us current. We actually might get to live in this current moment if we can work with the grief adequately enough. And also the current of life, the current of electricity, that we're meant to be kind of alive creatures, not just kind of slumping our way and backing our way into the grave, but actually living this life. So our choice to not experience our grief, to express it because of the lack of containment, kind of dulls us and numbs us and flattens us. And that's what I experienced in my practice, but that's what I experienced in my own life for many, many years. Just kind of the unexpressed weight of grief, kind of oppressing my life. So building these containers over the last many, many, many years, I've really seen what happens when we are given the permission and the strong enough holding space for the psyche to recognize the conditions are right. The conditions have been set. This is what psyche has been anticipating and expecting and requiring. But when those conditions are met, people will drop to the ground. They will go down to their knees and they will do the work of grieving. And with repetition, which is a very soulful element, I love repetition. That's why we do rituals again and again. And many people come back to these grief rituals over and over again, not because they're not getting it, but because they recognize that this process is what keeps them closest to their own vitality, their own aliveness. And to keep that, what we could call soul hygiene, that we're ongoingly emptying the cup, the communal cup. It's not, again, not just for me individually, but that's what helps keep a community sane and healthy, is this ongoing gathering at the grief shrine or the gratitude shrine, whatever it is, but there's something that allows us to continue the work of moving the grief forward. And it can't do that, typically can't do that in isolation. It requires the containment field. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. So what I hear you say also is that maybe in modern or Western modern cultures, we brought the individual to such a level of isolation in this hyper individual world or with individualism that we actually lost the capacity of collective containment, and that a part of our psyche actually needs that to be able to run through certain processes. That's a powerful sentence also, like that we need the collective for certain functions.
Right.
But if we are too isolated, we don't get to those functions.
Right. And I think there's a way in which psychology is kind of colluded with that, in a sense of you go to private practice to address your grief, and that's fine. Absolutely. It's a good place to start. But I tell almost everybody I work with, this is a good place to learn how to tolerate contact with grief.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, you'll need a larger holding space for that grief to really fully move. But most of us are terrified of our grief. So coming to an individual working one-on-one, that could be a very helpful place to start. I remember going to a continuing education class with Rick Hansen some years ago. I'm sure you know Rick, and his work is beautiful. And when I'm listening to all of these wonderful interior practices for working with trauma, with working with dysregulation, with working with grief, or whatever is there. And as I'm practicing these things, I'm also reminded internally that the original practice was communal. The original ways that we re-regulated after trauma or death or whatever was communal. And that one is the one we've basically abandoned. I wouldn't say we've lost it. I think we've forgot it. Because when we're back in it, some part of us remembers almost instantly. That's what I've been waiting for. Carl Jung called it the unforgotten wisdom at the core of the psyche. So that wisdom is in us, that we've just kind of forgotten it. But when we get close to it again, the resonant signature kind of quickens the whole psychic field. I'm sure you've seen that many times. When people step into that contained space, there's a moment of recognition, even if they've never done it before. This is what I've been waiting for.
Exactly. As you said, I've seen this so many times, and the benefit of being in these large collective spaces is incredible. And even in those spaces, many of our therapists that work one-on-one within those spaces to support certain deeper things that need a one-on-one treatment in that moment, say, listen, in these spaces, this work that takes me usually 5 sessions happens in half an hour because of the strong field. And it's exactly what you said. That's so deep in us. When we step into those fields, we remember that. That's a very powerful saying. The question that comes up when I listen to you is like, why did we forget? What's the forgetting? That you said something very strong, like we forgot that. And I'm wondering, okay, why did we forget or sacrifice grief spaces, for example, grieving spaces, where what's that function? Like what is that? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know the whole history, obviously, but I would say that one of the primary things that happened is that we went from the village mind to the heroic mind. Uh, the village mind is aware of the interpenetration of all of our lives together. And like in the Okanagan people in British Columbia, their word for belonging translates as our one skin. So to know that at a felt level, that what befalls me, I will be held, I will be caught, I will be supported, and whatever happens to you, I can be there for you. That there's this mutual entanglement of our lives. In the heroic model, the individualism model you mentioned, you do it alone. You go it alone. And so the associations that come with heroism are invulnerability, control, dominance, constant rising. But where does grief take us? It pulls us down. And the heroic has no response to the down. That's the defeat of the hero. There's the descent into the underworld of grief, of loss, of vulnerability, of tenderness, of being lost, of being uncertain. Those are not heroic qualities. Those are soul qualities. So when we're invited into that territory, it feels overwhelming, frightening, and we're scrambling instantly to try to find the exit. And we do that through anesthesia or busyness or addiction or by all kinds of means. But lingering in the darkness is not something we know much about. And that's where we're being taken collectively right now.
Relationships actually are a contemplative spiritual practice, if spirituality means not bypassing, but actually deepening and using the resources of mindfulness and presence, and also noticing when I'm not present, when I'm completely identified with emotions or body sensations from my past, that I go through fears and stuff that is not related to what's happening right now, but I feel it very intensively. So the way we look and the way we frame that for ourselves makes a huge difference.
We often say that the greatest gift you can give someone in a relationship is your presence. But in order to be present in the relationship, you have to be in the present. I have a saying, there's no such thing as overreacting. It's just that what someone's reacting to may not be what's in front of them. It may be what's behind them. And that's triggering. When we're completely seized by that automatic response, which has everything to do with our childhood and family of origin and wounding, that there's a space, there's a breath. And rather than acting out whatever that defensive move would be, there's a possibility of looking at it, of feeling it, and then maybe not going with it, but going with something else. And that moment of moving beyond the automaticness to something aware, and then moving from the awareness to a different choice, that's healing. That's what healing is.
Love, Trauma, and Healing is a groundbreaking, self-paced online course from Thomas Hübl and couples therapy expert Terry Rio. Learn to heal past wounds and more deeply connect with yourself, your relationships, and the world at large, using wisdom from psychotherapy and spiritual practices. For a limited time, we're offering a special $100 discount for our Point of Relation podcast community. Visit the link in our show notes or go to www.lovetraumahealing.com/podcast to learn more and start the course today.
Very much so. I love it. I love it. Also, I mean, the question is also what in us needs to be heroic, or what is that an after effect of or from, like how we went there. But maybe we can come back to this later. You said something very powerful just now. that like being invited into the dark, you often call it, I think, the long dark. And maybe you can speak a little bit about that. Like what are we being invited into in this specific moment in human history
Hmm.
on the planet?
Yeah, I think that's a critical question of if this is intelligible in any way, if there's a directionality to this, if the long dark is actually an invitation toward disruption and dislocation, because the current trajectory is quite disastrous, quite destructive to the planet and to the psyche, that maybe this time of descent is absolutely vital. In the old alchemical traditions, they talked about the necessity of the negredo, the blackening. And the negredo was called the subtle dissolver. And when the negredo began, uh, they said that was the beginning of soul work. Soul work could not commence until there was enough trouble, in a sense, what they call the putrefactio. Great terminology in alchemy. The mortifactio, the dying and the decaying material becomes the beginning foundation for the soul work to commence. That's so different than our Western psychological mindset. So the long dark, the way I imagine it, is that it is this period of descent into the underworld where we are invited into a gestational stillness. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going on. So in the long dark, we enter into that place of the unknown and the unshaped. And it's a place of deep humility where we have to get quiet and slow and, in a sense, yielding to some deeper intelligence. Like, hopefully, the soul of the world is also involved in what is happening right now. And our work is to become receptive enough. This term from the Inuit people, Kartsaluni, comes to mind. And Kartsaluni translates sitting quietly together in the dark, waiting expectantly for something creative to occur. Now, I think that's where we are. We're not going to think our way through this. We have all the data we need. We know the levels of CO2. We know the impact of all of this. But why isn't it moving? So there's some other way in which we have to approach this. So I trust the long dark. I trust that in this place of silence and quiet, something might actually be dreamt up from below and dreamt into us that teaches us once again how to be true human beings, how to live in accord with the world, how to live relatively peacefully with one another. There's always going to be conflict. Um, but the long dark is that invitation towards not knowing. And I think you said the other day, not knowing is most intimate, that Zen phrase. When we don't know, in a sense, we can give up all of the ideological structures we've been holding on to and be open to revelation. What is trying to be expressed here? What are we being asked to know? So that's enough about that.
That's beautiful. I love it. I love also that this soul of the world, the anima mundi, is that there is a soul process happening, and I think that's something very important to see. And I think the overlap between, because I think not slowing down has a reason, because when we slow down, the past catches up. And I think there's a lot of past that at least parts of the world, out of different reasons, don't want to have catch up. Because it's gonna confront us with some of our ethics, with some of our pain, with some of our, like, in that slowing down and sitting. I think there are two processes. The one is the what I sometimes call the great detox, like the detoxification of the past that we never wanted to see and or couldn't see. And the other one is exactly this, that something out of that stillness emerges that is actually a creative movement. And I'm wondering if you in your work, like, because I think one of the arts, and maybe the arts of alchemy and the arts of transformation, is how to be in both or be open, because one comes, I think, entangled a bit with the other. That we listen to the revelatory process of the creative new movement that emerges, but at the same time that we are confronted with the pain that we looked away from, and that's why we were running for a long time. And so now when things go down, I think the discernment or the capacity to be in both, and maybe you can speak a little bit how we can sit in both, because one is might be, at least for some time, uncomfortable, and you said we anesthetized ourselves maybe for some time. So maybe you can speak about this two-ness in the sitting, in the slowing down.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question, because I think the framing of it has to be communal rather than singular. I don't know if it's really possible to sit with all of that discomfort and grief and loss by myself.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of the reasons why we don't go there. You know, we shut that door, we slam it tight, and we bolt it, and hopefully never have to go in there. And I have hundreds of times heard in my practice, if I go into that grief, I'm never coming back. And what I usually end up saying is that if you don't go there, you're never coming back.
All right.
Because psychically we spend so much of our energy keeping it at bay and not really being inside this aliveness. So one of those things about learning how to befriend the mess, the grief, the pain, the hurt. That doesn't mean it's comfortable, but we have to build some capacity to be in relationship to that energy. And this is a core part of any kind of holding space or working with our own grief, is making sure that we're approaching it from the position of the adult. Something you would say is what that quality of presence. Can I be present for what is here? Well, that's an adult state.
Mm-hmm.
Those fragmented complexes, the child parts can't do that. They just want to survive. All praise to survival. But the need is deeper than that. When the need is greater in the sense that we need support to be in those places too. Yeah, I forget the second part of it was the being with the difficulty and being with revelation.
With the revelation.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
I think when we're able to be soft towards what is troubling us, we are more porous to revelation.
Mm-hmm.
That's why that second book, we are at the threshold of loss and revelation. Something can happen in that threshold space. When I have opened my heart to what is troubling me, I am simultaneously receptive to the impulse of soul. So to a deeper intelligence.
Mm.
Yeah.
I also feel that when you speak it, it reaches me, that threshold and the openness of the heart to be pulsing in that space. And I think that's a very powerful state. So that's really beautiful. And the thing that you said, it's so interesting. When I go to that grief, I will never come back. Like, as if the grief, like the how we other the emotions, like as if the grief is not me and I'm going there. And then you answer with, then you'll never come back if you don't go there, because we are not here when we are not with the grief. We are somewhere else anyway.
Right,
and I think
right.
that's a great change. Like when people say, I want to get rid of my fear, without my fear, my life would be so much greater. But who says without my liver, my life would be so much greater?
Right,
What's the difference between my liver and my fear? And then that makes it, that's a stark contrast, but it makes it very visible how we want to get rid of ourselves in some way instead of integrating. So thank you for bringing that back in. And
Yeah.
you're anyway not here when we are not with the grief.
And why is that? I mean, again, I think I really appreciate and have great compassion. I mean, I did it myself for many decades, finding ways to avoid those places. And partly the necessity of that avoidance is because we have been sentenced to solitary confinement with them.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's no community around this place, it's too much for me to walk toward. So I have great compassion. And that's why when I talk to people in my office here, it's like, let's build our capacity to be with this. Part of that fear, because it was rarely ever held in our lifetime, is that grief space feels bottomless, that we're rarely having a pure grief moment. We usually end up having a grief panic moment. That when I get close to that grief, there's this instant expectation that I will be in free fall forever and I'll never, ever come back. It's as if grief is going to take me and swallow me whole. And I've never, ever seen that.
Mm-hmm.
When we develop any quality of hospitality towards our sorrow, it ripens us and deepens us. And it expands our capacity to be with what is.
Mm-hmm.
And not only in my life, but also in the community, also in the watershed, also in the culture, you know. And that's what we need right now. We need ripened human beings who know how to step into the street, and particularly with the youth, to be able to look at them and say, I see you, and I will sit with you here in this place. You know?
Exactly. Yeah, it's beautiful how you're speaking to that maturity, because the issues of this world are being solved in mature perspectives and not in regressive perspectives. And that's why that maturation. I love that sentence that you also said with the hospitality. If you can bring any hospitality to that grief, then we're maturing. That's a very powerful sentence.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you want to tell us something that touches me in the way you formulate it is the village, the river, and the canoe. Maybe you can speak a little bit to these three words.
Yeah, I had the fortune of being good friends with a man named Malidoma Some, and we worked together for many years, and I got to visit his village, and you witness something there that you just don't see here in the United States. Uh, their sense of responsibility to the village uh, supersedes their sense of responsibility to themselves. It's like they understand that if the village is well, the individual will be okay. You know, that that attention to the quality of the village is what allows family and individual lives to flourish. We've inverted that 100%, 180 degrees here, where it's the individual is the pinnacle of attention, maybe family, and then community or villages. That's empty rhetoric, but for the most part. So what I saw there, I got to be there long enough to witness several funerals. And those funerals last 3 days, and everyone is involved. It's like the whole village just kind of shuts down. The food goes there, the drummers, the dancers, the wailers, the family, the person who's dead is up on a kind of a throne. And the grieving, you begin to understand what they say is that it's the responsibility of the village to weep enough tears to carry this soul to the land of the ancestors. And they can't get there without an adequate river of tears. Now, that makes my grief very necessary, very essential to a kin who have just died. And I want them to get home. I want them to get to that ancestral ground. Well, that needs my tears. I have a job to do. I have a responsibility. So whether that's actual or not, I don't know. But it allows and ennobles the value of grief. as a spiritual responsibility, that it's my job to grieve adequately for the one who is gone. And I just love that, rather than apologizing for our grief, which often happens at funerals and, well, I'm so sorry, I've lost control. Lose control. Let's weep that river of tears. I remember Martine Prachtel saying that this culture is saturated with ghosts because very few of them were ever given that adequate send-off. The tears weren't there. So we're populated with a lot of unwept ancestors. And you can feel that, I think, in our own psychological lives.
Yeah, very much so. I love also the feeling of grieving, creating this river that the ancestors can cross over is also a way, because when we really allow our emotions, like the grief cycle, to really be there, we also can let go and we can continue life. But if not, then we stay entangled. And then it's exactly what you said much earlier. Then we are in these grief cycles many years later,
Yes.
because we never really grieved. So it's like stays like a repetitive cycle in us. That's a different repetition than the repetition of a ritual. That's another repetition.
Yeah.
But it shows that we never really let our ancestors go, or the people go that are passing away. I think that that's very beautiful, and it's also so much filled with love, because grief and love and relationship and loss, they're all care.
Inseparable.
So
Inseparable. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
beautiful. So I told you already that, like, we have been working on large traumatizations that where many of the ancestors of the people that are in the room um, have not had that river properly, because it was in war situations, it was in genocidal situations, and it was so shocking that often those tears have never been cried until today. So we talked about the village now, with the villagers coming together and being in the grief. How about our ancestors, the ghosts of our ancestors that populate our society? Like, let's see how that relates to your grief work. How do you meet that ancestral grief and the importance of expanding from my grief because I lost somebody to the larger grief of the community, for all the people that have never been grieved really, or like because there were shocking moments in history.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe let's speak a bit how that shows up in your grief rituals.
Oh, frequently. I mean, we when we gather, there's a wide range of sorrows in the room, but inevitably someone's there because of ancestral grief. They're dealing with the death of or an alcoholic grandfather, or something in the storyline, or something in the collective storyline is very present in their lives. And so their images are saturating our grief shrine. And I don't know the spiritual technology of this, but I do feel, and they also report that when the rituals are over, there's a feeling that the healing went in all directions. That the healing was not time bound. It was, in a sense, we healed the ancestral and we healed the generations yet to come. We are doing something in that moment of total transparency, when the soul and the soul of the community are so self-evident that reverberation, I think, is healing, and there's a restoration. I truly feel that when we gather, the ancestors come, they're delighted that we're there. They're so happy. In many cultures, in Russia and Africa, I have found that they believe that our tears are food for the ancestors, that actually this nourishes them, this feeds them. So when we as a collective have stopped weeping together, the nourishment stopped. And so there was this kind of disruption in the ecology between worlds. And so I like that when we do this, we feel like this is something that's nourishing to them. And then they can become more robust ancestors for us, you know. So we recognize that the work we're doing is not just solitary or singular, it is multi-dimensional and multi-layered. Yeah.
It's beautiful because it reminds me also that you said something I think that is very true, at least in some cultures, is that when we don't grieve, we harden the veils in between the worlds. Like we close them off more than we keep them open and breathing. That the different worlds, like also spiritually, the different layers of our physical world and the subtle worlds and the worlds of our ancestors, like we are closing the thresholds. And then it seems like we are more locked into this materialistic world versus that there is an open communication, there's an open data flow in all directions, as you said, that we can communicate with the future generations and we can communicate with the ancestors. There's a data flow that gives us much more meaning because we are part of a context, and not just intellectually because it sounds great, but because we feel it. And I think that's a beautiful sentence that you said about it. It closes a bit the connection to this, or the veils, or the curtains to the other worlds. I think that's very true.
It's beautifully said. I think what I've seen is that, and again, going back to the old alchemical idea, that our work is to keep the material warm, to stay engaged with it. I know that grief works us in many ways, but we're also asked to work grief. It's a reciprocal relationship. It changes us, it reshapes us, it deepens us, but it only deepens us as if we engage it also. So we have to engage the material and keep it warm. So what I sense is that when we don't engage the material turns cold. And whatever turns cold hardens and congeals. And why do we think that congestive heart failure is the number one cause of death in this country? Well, it's not just cigarettes or too much fat. It's also the congested heart of sorrow that if we don't warm that material, we can't move. We can't feel the relational, not only to the other worlds, but even to this world. That world becomes even dulled and opaque. So keeping the heart warm, keeping the material moving is the real intention. We're not meant to be chronically hauling around generations of grief. That's not what we're meant to be doing. So we have to deal with it. We have to engage it. And I've seen that hundreds and thousands of times. So
that's beautiful. Yeah, and it also reminds me of, the challenge with it is also when we keep the material warm, the warmth of the material will melt also the concealed, because I believe very much that the trauma frozenness, when it melts, it gives way to the ethical transgressions that often lie beyond the trauma. And that's something I think that really needs our maturity to re-own some of the, being it racism, being it colonialism, being it Holocaust, being it like there's so many large wounds in the world. And I think if we really engage those deeper emotions, we also have to engage a massive societal transformation that is a consequence of allowing those. So I think that's something important to take into account when we keep the material warm, that it will challenge us as human beings deeply. Again.
Well, that's why we look at the necessity and the wisdom of ritual practices. Where do we take that material? Where does it need to go? Well, it needs, again, a holding space potent enough to handle bitterness, to handle betrayal, to handle all the ways in which we have, been diminished in our own humanness, or that we've diminished others in their humanness. So we need spaces that are strong enough to hold all that. Michael Meade, a wonderful mythologist, talked about the 3 layers of experience. The first layer is the social layer. Hey, how's it going? Nice day today. Yeah. Have a good one. The third layer is deep soul contact, where we feel that kind of transparency between us, we feel that unification of heart, mind, and soul. Second layer is anger, betrayal, bitterness, grief, violence. And he said you can't get from layer 1 to layer 3 without going through layer 2. And we are layer 2 phobic because we lack the mechanisms, ritual-wise, to hold those things adequately. So those things get unaddressed. And they don't just stay there passively then, do they? They escape into the collective field and become part of our collective identity, as anger and grief, rage is running through the streets. But there's no place to contain it, and no place to hold it, and no place to help transmute it into its next shape, because everything's always on its way to someplace else. But if it can't get there, it doesn't just, again, stay there passively. I was doing an interview on Monday with a young man from Israel, and we talked about this, kind of unspoken sequencing of unmetabolized grief mutates into bitterness. And bitterness metastasizes into vengeance, into violence. And that cycle goes unbroken until we go back to that original grief, that we have to, again, deal with the collective sorrows, the massive numbers of people who have suffered and are suffering currently. We have to hold that collectively. And without ritual ground, without contained spaces, it just consistently infuses the collective with fear, with mistrust, and a sense of, protecting mine.
Exactly. Very powerful.
Thank you for tuning in to Point of Relation. The rest of Thomas and Frances's conversation will air in next week's Part 2 episode. We hope you'll join us again to continue this rich and meaningful exchange.
Thanks for listening to Point of Relation with Thomas Hübl. Stay connected and get updates about new episodes by visiting our website, pointofrelationpodcast.com, and by subscribing to the Thomas Hübl YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share about us with your community on social media. Thank you. We appreciate your support.